Coming up on this week's podcast, has Brazil left Lando Norris with a hand on the driver's title? Is all hope over for Max Verstappen? Was Oscar Piastri unfairly punished? And what should Ferrari do next following its nightmare in São Paulo? It's time for the latest episode of the Racing News 365 podcast. Hello and welcome to the latest episode of the Racing News 365 podcast, looking back at last weekend's São Paulo Grand Prix. From Racing News 365, my name is Nick Golding, and I'm delighted to be joined, as always, by the awesome duo that is 2023 Young Journalist of the Year, Sam Absolutely Coop, and the man, the myth, the almighty legend, that is lead editor Ian Parks. We have so much to discuss, guys, but I think we've got to start with something pretty simple because forget, death and taxes. There are two things in life you can always guarantee and depend on. Max Verstappen doing something to stun us and leave us speechless, and Ian, chaos in São Paulo.
It was fab, wasn't it? It was everything that we come to expect from a São Paulo Grand Prix at Interlagos. It's just a brilliant old school circuit. Great undulations. It just lends itself to brilliant racing. There was great overtaking aplenty, not just from Max Verstappen. It was all throughout the field. And it's just one of those that shows how a circuit should be, in my book. We have many a circuit these days that's just meh. Abu Dhabi being one of them. Sorry, Abu Dhabi. It just is. It's never lent itself to a great race there in all the time we've been going. And then you come to an old school, as I say, circuit like Interlagos, and you're just left breathless, left speechless. Its infrastructure has changed, obviously, over the years. I remember going there last race of 06 when Fernando Alonso beat Michael Schumacher to the title, last race of 07, last race of 08. And you were worried back then when you were going to Interlagos. It was the infrastructure around Interlagos was dodgy, to say the least. There were, unfortunately, favelas on the outskirts of it, but they've slowly been eroded over time. And now it's just a better place to be. But nevertheless, Interlagos, the actual racing track, has never really changed. It's always retained its tremendous character, and that has always, for the most part, lent itself to just a tremendous race, as we saw again on Sunday.
And very quickly, Sam, that's actually a really good point that Ian's made, is obviously Interlagos is still very much an old school venue in terms of the circuit itself. Very little has changed in regard to the layout, which is a really good thing because we have had so many times in recent years the old school circuits really struggling to keep up with the times of Formula One, not giving us good races, resulting in some obviously falling off the calendar or becoming biannual, whereas Interlagos remains year on year just brilliant.
It is a steadfast of the calendar, isn't it? I think the race that everyone kind of always refers back to when they go, yeah, that's the circuit that really you can count on year out. And it feels like there's, in some ways, a lot of these tracks that are shorter, more traditional, more compact, do offer good racing because you're more routinely, more quickly back at those points where you get overtaking, where you get action. The Red Bull Ring is another one, a very short lap. And the Interlagos, there's obviously the main straight, or kind of three corners, which makes a straight. And then the center S's are fantastic. Then the run down to turn 4, it's a great part of the circuit. And then within 70 seconds, you're back at it. And so there's action throughout the field, throughout the race, and that's what I think really lends to what makes it a great circuit. And also undulation. Ian mentioned it. Seems to be a consistent with all these great tracks. Little bit of kind of ebb and flow, and it just makes it so delicious as a prospect to watch.
Why can't Herman Tilke copy some of these? Because you think Kota as well, which has got that great run up to turn 1, which I love. That's not a Herman Tilke track, by the way, folks. That was designed by others. And yeah, obviously some of these Herman Tilke tracks have just been duds over time. I mentioned Abu Dhabi, unfortunately.
Bahrain's all right.
Herman.
Yeah,
Bahrain's okay. Herman, just look at someone like Interlagos. It's just, if you want to do a new track, mate, there you go. There's your blueprint.
Right, we have got so much to discuss and dissect, but this wouldn't be a Racing News 365 podcast without starting with a fun question to get our thinking juices going. And this one is kind of in honour of Oliver Bearman a little bit because he's now had back-to-back top 6 finishes. So, for this week's episode, the question is, how many top 6 finishes has Haas achieved since it entered F1 in 2016?
Oh,
7.
good question.
Ian's straight in with 7.
It's very, very strong. Yeah, it's definitely fewer than 10, right? I was going to go with 8. Yeah, could be 6.
Okay, well, technically, I mean, Sam, you're closest. It's actually 18, believe it or not.
18?
Haas enjoyed quite a few top 6 finishes in the early years of its time in the Formula One. Obviously went through some difficulties around 2020, 2021, but also the last couple of years as well, particularly with Nico Hulkenberg, before he left to join Sauber, did some really good results for them. So yeah, it's 18 top 6 finishes. That was some research by myself last night. But thank you very much. That surprised me as well, I'll be honest.
Yeah.
There's also many other things which surprised me in Sao Paulo, and we'll get on to that. So first things first, Sam, what was your biggest takeaway from last weekend?
So my biggest takeaway was it was the first, or not the first, but the clearest example I can think of the sprint format kind of critically altering the path of a weekend. And what I mean by this is that Red Bull got it wrong repeatedly, or twice over the weekend. It wasn't until the race that they really got things right with the setup of Max's car. If they had had 3 hours of practice, the chances of them getting that right through a process of elimination over those 3 hours is much higher. They would have had multiple bites of the cherry. So I think that is a sure sign that, I don't know, whether the sprint format works or whether it doesn't is ultimately, down to, whoever's discretion or, personal opinion. But McLaren, with a wide operating car, it's easier to get the MCL39 into that window it needs to be than the RB21. And that is what we saw essentially at Interlagos, is McLaren were able to do that far easier, and it took Red Bull all weekend, potentially to the detriment of Max. But again, we can discuss, whether or not he would have won and all that kind of all the variables there across the rest of the podcast.
I think for me, my biggest takeaway, and I'll go for something different, and it's Oscar Piastri. I think we'll discuss what happened in the race in much more detail later on, whether his penalty was fair or not fair. Yes, that will be making a return. But if you look at the sprint race, it was such a, it was a mistake again. He knew the curbs were wet, and Nico Hulkenberg, and Franco Colapinto all made the same mistake of dipping a tyre onto that curb. Yes, changes were then made ahead of the race to try and get rid of some of that water, but importantly, that water was there at the time. Surely they would have known that. Was Oscar just trying to be, a bit too ambitious, trying to test the limits too much, and also went beyond it? Because that's, we spoke so many times this year that he has been faultless, making no mistakes. All of a sudden, this is now almost every Grand Prix for the last several races. At least one mistake in every single one, dating back now to really Singapore. And it's interesting that it is the pressure. I think Oscar is showing that maybe he couldn't handle the pressure after all. He's now got to roll up his sleeves, get his elbows out, because if he wants to win this world championship, boy oh boy, does he need the final 3 rounds of his life. Ian, for you, your biggest takeaway.
Go on, Sam.
Go on, Sam.
So I was just going to very, very quickly, actually, just sorry to interject there, Ian, just to add to your point there, Nick, because I think Martin Brundle kind of described it in a way that I thought was really interesting over the weekend, where he talks about how we thought that Oscar was able to kind of deflect this pressure in a way that Kimi Räikkönen, say, used to be able to. But actually what is fast appearing is that he's actually just been absorbing it the whole time. And that at some point has to go somewhere. And this is now what we're kind of seeing play out, is all of that pressure that he has absorbed over the season. He's at capacity. He can't handle that critical mass anymore. And it's starting to kind of show in his results, which I think is a fascinating point.
Very interesting point. Ian, for you, your biggest takeaway?
Funny enough, guys, probably peaked too soon here, because we've actually already discussed it, because I know you always bring up this topic within the show, and it actually is about Interlagos and the beauty of that circuit and how it's changed over time, but nevertheless the circuit itself has remained unaltered. and it still lends itself to the great racing. It was actually going to be my main point, but of course, with regard to this segment of the show, as I said, but unfortunately, we've already discussed it. It's just, for me, it's iconic. It's just an iconic circuit. Just to give people a little bit of a flavor for Interlagos from a media perspective, I've obviously been there many times. I wasn't there this weekend, but nevertheless, when you go from the paddock, which is at a really high level, the media center now is um, way down. They've relocated it. It used to be sitting on top of the paddock, but now it's in a different location. But nevertheless, you've still got this area as you come out of the paddock. There's a small roadway, and then you've got this set of stairs that lead all the way down to where the media center is. But that roadway and that platform at the top of that set of stairs, it just has the most gorgeous view, panoramic view across pretty much all of Interlagos. The only section of the track you can't see from that viewing platform is actually the main straight behind you. But nevertheless, it just looks spectacular. You can see every other part of that circuit, even the turn going up the uphill section that leads on to the main start-finish straight. And it's just beautiful. They don't make them like that anymore. And obviously, there's a reason why, unfortunately. But for me, Interlagos is, and always will be one of the greatest F1 tracks.
It's my favourite Grand Prix every single year. And it's just brilliant. Right, before we get on to some big topics, we've, of course, got to look back at the Racing News 365 predictions and see how our own championship is starting to shape up. And, well, I know I've already said in my intro, has Lando got one hand on the driver's title? I do think Ian has got one hand on the predictors table, starting in last. And unfortunately, Burned from Germany, who represented the fans, was unable to replicate Richie's heroics from Mexico City. Burned, unfortunately, only got 1 point for saying Verstappen in second. Of course, he finished in third, but 1 point for being a position above or below where you predicted. Sam, you got 4. You said Norris in second. Of course, he won. But you also got 3 points for saying Red Bull fastest pit stop, which was correct. I got 5 points for saying Norris in second. Of course, he won. And Russell in third. Of course, he finished fourth. So again, a place above or below where predicted. And I got 3 points for Lando Norris on pole position. You can see where this is going because the last person I've not mentioned is Ian, who got 10 points for saying Norris, for correctly predicting Norris on pole, a Norris win, a Red Bull fastest pit stop. And actually about that, it was for Yuki Tsunoda, 1.95 seconds, the fourth fastest pit stop of the season so far. Ian also said Verstappen in second. Of course, he finished in third. So, again, a point for being above or below, which means in terms of the standings, Sam, you remain comfortably adrift in last on 91 points. The fans are back in third on 98. I am just ahead in second on 99, and 27 points ahead of me is Ian on 126. So, Ian is cruising away, but as we saw from Richie in Mexico City, it only takes one Grand Prix to get a very big score. Still a lot of points to play for. Will we score them? Probably not. Right, anyways, let's begin with Lando Norris. I think it's the fairest thing to do. And Ian, we have spoken several times this season. I know we mentioned earlier about how Oscar, never makes mistakes, seems to survive the pressure. Lando all of a sudden has shown that he's not making mistakes now across several Grand Prix in a row. He's been flawless. He's been consistent. He topped every single session in Sao Paulo except SQ2, which was topped by Fernando Alonso. I mean, let's be honest. That doesn't really matter come end of the day because he's still got sprint pole and sprint win.
Perfect.
But regardless, though, this is a level of dominance I don't think, and this is from me speaking my personal opinion, I don't think I would ever see from Lando because of the mistakes he tended to always make. But this is him now in the driving seat to become world champion.
As we discussed in the post-race F1 update, this is a very different Lando Norris we are seeing compared to the Lando Norris at the start of the season and pretty much all the way through to the summer break. He's just a changed character, a changed personality. He touched on it a little bit himself in the post-race press conference, the official FIA one. And his comments refer to the fact that pretty much he's always been this kind of character that's taken things on board. He's taken media comments on board, people's opinions of him, and he's let those affect him to a certain extent. And we've seen that on many occasions with some of the comments he's come out with in the past. And he's obviously let certain incidents as well on track affect him quite deeply, kind of like ignored away at him. And he's probably in his own mind, he's mulled them over a bit too much, considered them far too unnecessarily. But now, as I say, it's almost like chalk and cheese between the two characters, between the two drivers on track as well, since the summer break. And obviously, unfortunately for Lando, their first race after the summer break was the Dutch Grand Prix. He retired late on in that, of course, fell 34 points adrift of Oscar in the championship standings. And at that particular stage, you should have put good money on Oscar to win the title. You were probably thinking you were going to be quids in by the end of the season. But the dramatic change since then, not only in Lando as a driver and as a personality, but of course in Oscar's own results and performances, has just been quite extraordinary, to such an extent that since that Dutch Grand Prix, Oscar has not finished ahead of Lando in the 6 Grand Prix since. And that gives you some idea of the turnaround. It's been a 58-point turnaround over these past 6 Grand Prix, from Lando being 34 points adrift to now 24 points ahead. So quite staggering performance from Lando. And he mentioned that he's changed within himself, this personality, this character, that he's now, okay, he still reads and listens to certain comments about himself, but now it's just like, I don't care anymore. I've moved on. I'm going to move on. And maybe what he's doing, he's freeing up his headspace, not letting all these things get to him. And he's now being able to pretty much single-mindedly focus on his racing. And if that is absolutely the case, then it was crystal clear, transparent over the course of the Sao Paulo Grand Prix weekend, pretty much to an extent in the previous Grand Prix in Mexico City, where he was almost faultless there. But certainly in Sao Paulo, that was just a level of performance and dominance across the course of the weekend that we have not seen from Lando Norris at all in his entire F1 career.
And of course, if we look at the races coming up, obviously, Andrea Stella has said that McLaren, should be pretty good in Qatar and Abu Dhabi, as you'd expect, given the track layout, the temperatures we see there as well. I mean, at the moment, those two tracks are probably designed for McLaren, let's be completely honest. That should be a rocket ship. Las Vegas, Sam, is the one remaining outlier because it's so low grip, it's so cool. It could be summer which favours Mercedes and Red Bull rather than McLaren. Is Vegas now suddenly the final hurdle for Lando to overcome, given that he has, he's 1 point shy of having a full race win advantage over Oscar?
Yes and no, because it is a huge step into the unknown. It feels like it is every year when we get to Vegas, and McLaren haven't been great there historically in the last couple of years, but we're still learning so much about that track, and it's a different time, a couple of hours earlier than before. So will that affect the temperature? Will that lend to McLaren? Have they addressed some of the weaknesses that they had there last year over the last 12 months potentially? But also the equaliser for Lando and his closest rival being his teammate in Oscar is they're both in the same car. So it really, I think, is the last brutally slim chance of Max Verstappen dragging himself kind of back into this in a way that would be meaningful for the season finale. But we are getting perilously close at this stage now to not even it being a championship fight by the time we get to Abu Dhabi, because Oscar's 24 points behind. He needs 2 really strong weekends now in Vegas and Qatar to get closer, and then see if it can go down to the wire. So I think, Lando, in some ways, I think you're fair to say Vegas is a final hurdle because of just, the lack of data and information that we kind of have going into it. But he knows that he just needs to be consistent now. He doesn't really need to win another Grand Prix over the course of the campaign. And he can just kind of see himself through. Because, if Oscar wins every single round, including the sprint in Qatar, Lando can finish second and still take the title. Obviously, that's a huge kind of whataboutism, and it isn't Formula IV at the end of the day. But that's where Lando is. And I think his mindset, Ian spoke to it as well, has been much improved. He was asked whether or not Brazil was a turning point in his season. He flat rejected it. He said, no, it's not. Nor was Mexico. He ended it by saying, what's there to be happy about or kind of celebrate? Can't get carried away. There's still a lot of work to do. It was almost a very kind of Kobe Bryant-esque moment, not to the same kind of impact, but, I think it was in the finals one year when he someone was like, oh, you must be happy to be 2 up. And he was like, what's there to be happy about? Job's not done. Same kind of situation for Lando. The job isn't done. He knows that, and he is keeping himself so level, so measured, keeping his focus as clean as possible. And Ian's absolutely right. It does feel like a very different Lando we've had in the second half of the season.
And it's obviously not just, the results which Lando's getting over Oscar. It's also, the pace at each Grand Prix across the recent races where again, yes, okay, Oscar crashed in the sprint. He obviously had the penalty in the race. But ultimately, again, with the exception of the first 20 minutes of first practice where Oscar seemed to be pretty quick and we were thinking, oh, hello, is this Oscar fighting back? Actually, again, across the entire weekend, Oscar's pace just wasn't on the same level as Oscar. That's going to, Oscar's pace, should I say, was not on the same level as Lando. Let me get that correct. And that's going to be the big thing for Oscar to address first of all is why is my teammate at the moment consistently so much quicker than me?
Yeah, we alluded to this in one of our updates over the weekend, and I referred to comments made by Stella in the post-qualifying debrief that he holds with the media on Saturday evening. He's the only team principal that does that, by the way, folks, which is an absolute godsend for us as media because he gives us something that we don't otherwise see or hear from anybody else. And it does prove very informative. And obviously, yes, the majority of the questions are related to McLaren, but in this particular aspect with regarding to Oscar, he was asked again as to why Oscar's performance had trailed off on the Saturday, and in particular in Saturday qualifying for the Grand Prix, in comparison to what we'd seen on Friday when he seemed to be getting himself back on track compared to what had happened in the United States and Mexico City Grand Prix weekends, where his performance was just at a completely different level to Lando Norris, of course. And Andrea mentioned that the conditions had changed on Saturday compared to Friday. In particular, the wind had shifted, that the conditions had become that little bit more low grip compared to what we'd seen on Friday. And that seemed to impact Oscar more compared to Lando, who Andrea mentions seems to be able to cope better when the conditions are low grip than Oscar. And Oscar has to try and adapt more and has been adapting over the course of these past few Grand Prix weekends. Now, as I mentioned, if Oscar's been struggling in these low grip conditions, then heaven help him in Las Vegas, because of all the circuits that we go to across the weekend, Las Vegas, with its evening nighttime running, given the much cooler temperatures, that is a seriously low grip track. It's also one where Lando might even struggle. McLaren's didn't have a good weekend there last year, and that was at a point in time when McLaren was aiming towards its eventual Constructors' Championship victory. Nevertheless, they finished behind both Mercedes, both Ferraris, and Max in his Red Bull. So that might be an indicator as to where McLaren might be in this coming Las Vegas Grand Prix weekend. And that might give us a little bit of a steer as well as to where we maybe place our predictions at the end of this episode for the Las Vegas Grand Prix. And then as I say, just getting back to Oscar, as I say, he's really now got to try and get himself out of this low grip funk. And if he can learn anything more out of Brazil compared to what he learned out of US and Mexico, then he's got to get on board very, very quickly, because he's really, as you say, Nick, he's now got to address this 24-point gap in very short order, because it is probably in his eyes, it's going to look a little bit of a sizable one now, bearing in mind we've only got 83 points left to play for.
You can tell that Ian's leading the Predictions Championship because you're very eager, mate, because the predictions for Vegas will be in next week's episode, not this week's. You're just wanting to get...
As I said that, as I was saying that, I just thought, a little thought popped in my head. No, we don't do it at the end of this episode. It's going to be at the end of next week's. Anyway, apologies for that.
Well, there's a reason to tune in.
Yeah, yeah, the
Exactly.
reasons to tune in. You just want to get across the finish line and get that. I mean, we need to get a trophy or something. I think that's something we're actually traveling. So a funny story. We're recording this on Monday. What's the date today? Monday, the 10th of November. We're actually heading over to Eindhoven at the Racing News 365 HQ tomorrow on the Tuesday. So maybe we can discuss there getting a trophy for the winner. I think that's very much needed. Right, let's do what's becoming a fan favorite segment very quickly as we're discussing Oscar. Fair or not fair regarding penalties. And of course, Oscar received a 10-second time penalty in the race for being judged wholly at blame for causing a collision, which effectively saw Oscar go into Kimi Antonelli, Kimi Antonelli going to Charles Leclerc, which took Charles Leclerc out of the race. And what's really fascinating is for those who listen to the Sky broadcast in the UK, Jamie Chadwick, of course, a British racing driver, Karun Shandok, former F1 driver, both said that actually, that's really harsh on Oscar. Kimi had a large part to play in that instant. Charles Leclerc himself also defended Oscar and said, hold on, Kimi deserves quite a bit of the blame there for effectively squeezing Oscar. He knew he was there. And I will go straight into it. I think penalty not fair. In my eyes, that was a clear as day racing incident. It was a case of 3-1 didn't go. Was it ambitious from Oscar? Perhaps. He only locked up in my eyes due to obviously what happened with Kimi squeezing him, had nowhere to go. For me, it's a racing incident. It was just very unfortunate for Charles Leclerc and probably felt hard done by, regardless of what penalty was going to get handed out. So yeah, in my eyes, definitely not fair. Sam.
Yeah, not fair in my view. I think I maybe would have very, very reluctantly accepted a 5-second time penalty that was mitigated down because Kimi also had a part to play in it. But I think it is a racing incident ultimately, in my view, and I think Oscar's lockup made it look worse than it was. But the lockup really was only the kind of the end of the incident, just before the contact, because Oscar was trying a last gasp kind of effort to prevent the contact with Kimi, and I think that is ultimately quite harsh on Oscar. It was race defining. Even if it was a 5-second, he probably could have finished second, really. And without a penalty, he almost certainly would have finished second. That's 8 points. That in itself could be championship defining. Is that really how we want the championship to be decided? And obviously you can look across the whole season, go this moment here, this moment here, this moment here. But you take my point that it could be critical at this stage of the year for Oscar's, increasingly evaporating chances in the championship. So yeah, I think that's where they got it wrong. Kimi ultimately did kind of pinch him. He came across. But I thought it was interesting from Charles because it was very ambitious, and you know the risk of going to the outside, and understand you make that move every time. If you're Oscar, if you're Charles, you do it, right? But he did ultimately put himself in a very, very fraught position, and the worst case scenario did happen for him.
It is worth pointing out that if it wasn't for that penalty, Oscar would have finished in second, which means that his deficit would not be 24 points. It would actually be 16. That's a massive difference. Ian, for you, fair or not fair?
I'm going to address this initially from the viewpoint of the stewards. And all season long, we now have what are known as the driving standards guidelines. And these came into effect at the start of this season. And if you read the stewards' document that followed after the penalty was applied, you can understand why a 10-second penalty was applied, because the front axle of Oscar Piastri's McLaren was behind the front mirror, the left side mirror of Kimi Antonelli's Mercedes. So therefore, Oscar's move was deemed to be an incorrect one, and he was wholly responsible, in the words of the stewards, for that accident. However, sorry, just to add as well, the front axle of Oscar's McLaren behind Kimi Antonelli's wing mirror at the apex of the corner. That's just to be absolutely crystal clear as to what I'm referring to there. Now, I can understand that because that was exactly the case. However, you only have to look at the overhead camera viewpoints in particular, And Karen Chandot, Sky Sports F1 analyst, did a very good analysis of this particular incident afterwards. And you can see that Kimi Antonelli's getaway was a poor one at the restart. In doing so, with Oscar and Charles behind him, Oscar quite clearly went to the inside, Charles on the outside. And as they approach that corner, they are almost pretty much line abreast. Almost all of their front wings are almost exactly in line with one another. So Kimi had left a gap on his inside that you could have fitted 2 double-decker buses through there, never mind a Formula One car. So the gap was there for Oscar to make that move. The only reason why Oscar's front axle was behind the wing mirror of Kimi's Mercedes was because Kimi had cut across to take the corner and Oscar had to hit the brakes. And therefore, that was the result of his lockup and obviously quite naturally locking up to prevent what could have been an even more serious incident between the two of them that could potentially have wiped out all 3 cars, never mind just led to the collision between Oscar and Kimi, but of course the ultimate after effect that it took out Charles Leclerc. So with regard to these driving standards guidelines, I do feel that yes, whilst they are there and in place, and whilst the letter of the law was applied to the guideline in this particular case, with regard to the various positionings of the cars as they took that apex, nevertheless, I do feel there was a degree of common sense that should have been applied into why the cars were in those particular positions at the apex. And on this occasion, for me, coming to the ultimate conclusion, the penalty was unfair on Oscar. But the guidelines are there. That's why it was a 10-second penalty. The stewards applied the letter of those guidelines.
And of course, for those watching this podcast on YouTube, be sure to let us know your thoughts on the penalty. Did you think it was fair or not fair? Let us know in the comments below. And that brings an end to this part of the episode for fair or not fair. Probably back next week, knowing us. Right, let's go on to Max Verstappen because it was a rollercoaster weekend for him, of course, finishing 4th in the sprint, being eliminated in Q1 in qualifying, starting in the pit lane for the new power unit, suspension changes, the setup changes, you name it, it was changed to the RB21, recovering from the pit lane to finishing 3rd, despite an early puncture as well. And Sam, the good chances are now, with 83 points to up for grabs, he's 49 behind, that's probably his title chances over. If we're being realistic, I know I'm driving the Max Verstappen hype train, but he likely now needs a Lando non-points finish, whether that be in the form of finishing outside the top 10 or a DNF. So the odds are very much stacked up against Max. Never say never, of course, but title chances might realistically be over. But that was, again, just him doing something unthinkable with that recovery.
Yeah, there's been a signal failure on the line, which has put a pretty sharp halt to the hype train at this stage. If we're going to continue that from a couple of weeks ago, the fan questions, I'm sorry. But yeah, Max has basically called it now, hasn't he? I can't remember exactly what he said, but he essentially turned to journalists and was like, you can stop writing about this now because it's just not going to happen. And I think, yeah, it's fair. We never count Max out until it's mathematically impossible, but he needs to win in Vegas, basically, because if he drops points to Lando in Vegas, that is pretty much done. And I haven't looked at the count back in terms of race wins and so on and so forth off the top of my head, but you go to Qatar, and if it's, actually there's a sprint, but anyway, you take my point, he needs a really strong weekend in Vegas.
Yeah.
But the main kind of crux of your question, it was just sensational yet again from Max. In fact, Lauren Meckies argued that it was basically on par with what he achieved in Sao Paulo 12 months ago, which is, I think, probably widely considered on a race-by-race basis the high point of his, let's face it, storied career. And it was a really impressive display. Yes, he was advantaged by a new power unit. Yes, he was advantaged by a third bite at the apple in terms of setup from Red Bull. But he got his head down. He was in some ways disadvantaged by the early puncture, But in some ways, it may have actually put him into the best position to kind of work through the field because it took him off the worst tyre and put him onto the mediums. There's a lot of debate as to whether or not he should have stayed out. Had he maybe been able to survive longer on that hard tyre, could he have taken that medium to the end? Potentially. Red Bull ultimately didn't feel it was winnable from the position that he was in. But I do think they got the best result that was available to them by changing the power unit and by making those setup changes, because otherwise you leave him in P16 in a mediocre car. He's not working his way through the field in any way near as effective fashion as he did. Even if he had qualified better, he still probably would have ended up stuck as he did in the sprint. So it was a drastic course of action at the time, but it ultimately helped minimise the damage and keep the ever, ever slim chance of a title alive.
What ultimately, though, Ian, really hurt Red Bull, and this is something Laura Mecky's discussed post-race, was he accepted that actually, across the start of the weekend, Red Bull simply made too many changes to the RB21. They tried too much to make that gap back to McLaren because Lando Norris looked so quick from the get-go in Brazil. And in the end, what Red Bull did, particularly when Parc Fermé reopened, obviously between the sprint race and qualifying, was they made Max's car worse in the end, which is why we saw him eliminated in Q1 on pace as well. That wasn't a fluke. That was purely the best Max had in that car. And it's an interesting lesson, isn't it, that Red Bull have thrown so many upgrades at this RB21, which have clearly improved the car when you look at Monza and the new floor. But even when you get these shiny new parts, as good as they might be, it only takes one thing to go out of line with a change for everything to fall apart again.
Yeah, exactly. I'll just help Sam out with the math initially. Basically, there's 83
Yes.
points left on the table from 3 Grand Prix plus the sprint in Qatar. For example, if Lando were to win the Las Vegas Grand Prix and Max was third, that would be Max out of the title running because it'd be 59 points adrift with only 58 available. So that gives you an idea as to the scenario that has to unfold in Las Vegas. However, bear in mind, Lando Norris crashed in Las Vegas on its debut at that venue 2 years ago. And as I say, McLaren weren't good there last year. And bearing in mind how good Max looked around Interlagos with that shiny new power unit in his car and the eventual changes that they managed to make to it to get it working in a really good window, then who's to say that Max won't take a significant number of points out of Lando and Oscar again as we come away from the Las Vegas Grand Prix? That's to be seen, of course. With regard to your particular point, Nick, yes, it just goes to show that the smallest of variations can have a major effect on the way a car works, because we've been extolling the virtues of that RB21 for a while now. And okay, Max was only third in Mexico City. And the car was not quite at its optimum at that particular Grand Prix weekend, but nevertheless, that was still a reasonable result. He still managed to take points out of the McLaren drivers, or at least close the gap even further compared to the gap that he had going into that particular weekend. But yes, Red Bull will be fully aware of just how sensitive sometimes the slightest change can be it in conditions, be it in whatever setup they might try to apply. And on this occasion, as Laura Mecchi has pointed out, they took a risk too far with that car, and it just left Max all at sea, during that qualifying session on Saturday afternoon. Thankfully, yes, they managed to make the power unit change. They made setup changes as well to the suspension, and that just turned Max's Red Bull into a rocket ship, basically. But for that very early puncture on that hard tire, there is a definite possibility that he might even have won that race if he'd been able to, because obviously then, bearing in mind the pit stops that they had to make afterwards, that would at least have left him with a little bit longer life left in that medium tire compared to the pit stop he had to make so early on in the race before he obviously switched back to the softs with about 14 laps to go, I think it was. Who knows? It would have been Lando Norris certainly chasing him for the victory, but as we saw, even Lando himself mentioned at the end of the Grand Prix that 10-second cushion that he ultimately had over second place Kimi and third place Max was a little bit too close for comfort. He wasn't expecting that. He was expecting greater performance from his McLaren over those closing stages, and he didn't quite get it. There would have been a degree of management, quite naturally, but he would have expected more. He made that clear himself. Could Max have won that Grand Prix from the pit lane? Could he become the first F1 driver to have done that? Never happened previously in Formula One history. We will never know, of course. The puncture laid waste to that possibility, but it was nevertheless a stunning performance from Max Verstappen. It's what we've come to expect from him in many ways, and he didn't disappoint once again around Sao Paulo, around Interlagos, as he didn't disappoint last year when he won that race from 17th on the grid in the wet conditions.
I feel like Ian has taken the controls of the Max Verstappen hype train with that. That was, it's bigging him up for being still in the title fight. I mean, I agree. I think Vegas is the all or nothing for Max. He must win in Las Vegas to keep his title hopes alive, and then we'll see what happens come the final two races. Right, I'm wary of time, and we've still got quite a bit to whiz through. So Sam, very quickly, I'll come to you, our F2 guru, because Kimi Antonelli is a driver suddenly growing in stature. Of course, finished second in both the sprint and the Grand Prix. Interestingly, is catching Lewis Hamilton in the battle for 6th in the drivers' standings, which for Mercedes would be such a big accomplishment that the driver that they chose to replace Lewis goes and finishes ahead of him in the drivers' standings. Kimi's finding some form all of a sudden.
Yeah, he's finding some form. He's finding his feet as well. And I think it's, testament is the word Toto Wolff used of what is to come from him. And it has also kind of validated the decision to keep him in the car next year, because it was just a case of getting through some of those difficult parts. But what we saw in Interlagos was quite a range of what he can do. He was on merit faster than George pretty much all weekend. Showed a lot of pace over one lap, 2 P2s on the grid. Very good in that area. But in the sprint, yes, he didn't quite pull it off and win the sprint, but you saw him apply a lot of pressure to Lando Norris in a car that you conventionally think is quicker than Antonelli's W16. And then his defensive display at the back end of the Grand Prix to fend off Max Verstappen was equally as impressive. And I mean, you really felt for him, because seeing that yellow nose in your wing mirror, in your mirrors, is probably quite terrifying. It's almost sinister that Max Verstappen kind of rocking up on your rear wing. And he made a slight mistake. I think it was a couple of laps to go, and it really kind of almost opened the doors for Max. I thought, no, Kimi, you'd almost got this. But he just managed to hold it off. And I think he was, yes, absolutely fantastic over the weekend. And this is what Mercedes have been saying all along, is he just needs the time to kind of build into himself and into his career. And that is what we're now starting to see. Next season, if he has another kind of Sergio Perez-esque kind of dip in Europe, you start to go, oh, God, you really can't have that level of inconsistency over a year. But you can forgive him for a rookie season. And yeah, I mean, we will discuss this very quickly, because I know, Ian, you're not best pleased with this stat, but he has now overtaken Lewis Hamilton as the driver to score the most points in their rookie season, which obviously in 2007 there was 17 rounds, I think you said, whereas we're already 17. On round 21, and also it was in the old point system as well, so Lewis could only get 10 exactly. So it's a bit of a bogus stat, but I thought I'd throw it there just to get your usual reaction to it.
It's a rubbish stat. It just doesn't count. Completely different eras. Almost, like you said, that the points then compared to the points on offer now is just so different. And there were only 17 races. There we go. Yeah, rant over. Move on.
Right. But yeah, okay. I think he was fantastic.
Yeah. Awesome. And obviously what it has meant, because obviously with George Russell finishing in 4th, is Mercedes has taken a massive step towards finishing 2nd in the constructors' standings. Mercedes sits on 398 points. Red Bull are in 3rd on 366, so 32 adrift. Ferrari, after their double DNF, nightmare, horror show, disaster, I don't know what you call it, they're on 362 and now in 4th, 36 points adrift. So Ian, very quickly before we bring this podcast to an end, Ferrari, I mean, let's be honest, the way that car's looking, 2nd is probably off the cards. There's a better chance of Max winning the title than Ferrari getting back to finishing 2nd. What do they do now? Because they've clearly got Lewis Hamilton, who, you could hear it in the media pen, it is getting increasingly frustrated with what's happened this season. Charles Leclerc is, as he said a couple of times this year, that it's just been a year to forget effectively. Nothing's really gone their way. Do Ferrari now just, swallow their pride, get through the final few races this year and just full focus on 2026? What else can they do?
Well, the full focus will have been there for quite some time. They've not put any shiny new parts on that car for quite some time now. The focus is obvious. That okay, if second is starting to fall by the wayside, and if Mercedes in particular replicate their form in Las Vegas from last season into this season, then second is looking almost nigh on impossible for Ferrari. But nevertheless, Ferrari did actually perform well there last year, so they're still in the hunt for third. And okay, that I know that doesn't sound an awful lot, folks, but there is still $10 million up for grabs between third and fourth position. It's still an awful lot of money at the end of the day, even for a team like Ferrari and all its might and all its resources. You still can't sniff at that. You still can't turn up your nose at that. You need every cent, every dollar that you can get to, maintain everything that you do on and off track. So for Ferrari, they're still going to go for it. They're not going to give up. Lewis, obviously, he said himself, he's got so much more to do and to prove over these final 3 Grand Prix. And he's going to want to end this season on as good a note as he possibly can to take that into next year. Charles Leclerc, obviously, likewise, although Charles has at least had a much better season in comparison to Lewis, who still has yet to get a podium for Ferrari after 21 Grand Prix now, extending that own little unwanted personal record with the team. So for Ferrari, they will still be going for it. Still a lot they can do. They're going to, as I say, want to finish on a high. And of course, they're going to want to gain as much constructors' money as possible before the season concludes.
And on that note, that brings an end to this week's episode of the Racing News 365 podcast. If you are watching on YouTube, please be sure to smash the like button, subscribe to the channel. Let us know your thoughts below on anything we've discussed or anything you want to let us know and your thoughts about Sao Paulo. And well, we will see you in next week's podcast where we will really look ahead to Las Vegas. For myself, Sam and Ian, we'll see you next week. See you later.
Thanks as always for watching and listening, folks. Take care until the next time.
Thanks for joining us.